share this with y'all, and I really like ASMR, so I thought that it could be a good format for me to stay interested in this, and for y'all to, be able to go to sleep, but also still feel productive at the same time, because now you're learning something. Um, but yeah, so I'll just start talking about what the book is. Basically, it's by this guy, Ibram X. Kendi. Ibram X Kendi. Kendi. Um, and Ibram X. Kendi is the author of the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, I think is the name, which is a really popular book for people trying to dismantle their racial biases, especially against black people specifically. How to stand up for black people. I haven't personally read it, but it's definitely on my list because I really like the way that he writes, and I think that obviously that's a very valuable thing to talk about. And obviously I'm white, so it's helpful for me to, have someone to be able to help me figure out how to dismantle those biases. But this book is a definitive history of racist ideas in America. So basically, part of it is tracking the beginning and the progression of racist ideas from the beginning of America and even the whole world, but also talking about what we can do with that. So where to move forward from that. I think it's really interesting. So we're gonna just pop it open. Find my first annotation in here. Oh, do you want to hear it? Was that a good trigger? I don't know. It's my first time. How would I know? But anyway, so so it starts in the preface that I started annotating. But it is basically the preface is saying that this was made during Trump's first election. So when he was first elected in 2016, a lot of people, specifically anti-racist people, that had been seeing the progression of rights for black people and other marginalized identities were advancing because of Obama being the first black president for 8 years. It was supposed to continue that progress with Hillary Clinton being elected, which would be the first female president. But then, this this Republican candidate is elected, and he is, a pretty regressive, racist, bigoted guy. As we know, obviously in the current political climate, that's more important than ever to be talking about what, Trump does. But even before he did all the shit that he does in this term, in his first term, he was not, supposed to be elected, if that makes sense. But as the history of the book shows, or is supposed to show at least, I haven't read all of it, so I wouldn't really know completely, but as racial progress, such as, allowing, I don't know, but progress in, racism, in stopping racism in the government, like Barack Obama was attempting to do, racist ideas were still culminating. They were culminating at the same rate that the racial progress was culminating. So he is, I don't know the word. He's basically saying that as racial progress marches forward, that racist progress follows that at the same pace. So he has a great example of how this works in the preface, which is why I have it annotated. Little pink one, got it from Target, even though I'm supposed to be boycotting. I'm sorry, guys. Yeah. But anyway, so it talks about how, I'll just read it out for you right now. It says, when the Obamas of the nation broke through targeting specifically black slaves. That is how the world came to see black people were slaves, is that black people were slaves. So the idea came from the policy rather than the policies coming from the idea. So I think it's really useful to think about it in like from the capitalist standpoint. So it's saying like, Zurara, which is the Portuguese, basically the person who popularized the slave trade of enslaved Africans, specifically in West Africa, from Portugal. He was not originally, saying we should go out and enslave black people specifically because they are inherently worse or worse off than white people, and that they are a different race, and we should enslave them. He originally went to, enslave anyone, basically, is what he's saying. But that created that mindset that, black people were slaves because those were the highest reserves of people that they could enslave at that time. So that's the claim that he makes, and I think that's really interesting because I hadn't thought of it that way. Originally, I thought of it how, most of America thinks about it in that, there were some people that were ignorant, like they might not have been around black people because of slavery or segregation, and they just hadn't interacted with them, and they just thought of them as less than because those were the stories that people told. But I think it's really insightful that he's talking about the stories are told the way that they're told because of these policies that were already in place. So it's kind of like you have to swap your mind around to understand how racist ideas come around, and I think that's a really cool aspect of this book. So let's move on. The next part that I have annotated is in page 3. Oh, page 2 actually, sorry. It introduces his ideas of the 3 different people that the book tracks. So the first group is segregationists, which are, the outright racist people. That's the people you think of when you think of racists. Those are the people that think that there is inherently something wrong with black people. So, yeah. And then group 2 is anti-racists, which are the people that don't believe that there is inherently anything no. So the anti-racists believe that the reason why black people are worse off, or some actions happen by black people, is because of racial discrimination for the cause of some things happening. And then assimilationists, group 3 is assimilationists. These are liberal people, neoliberal type people. And basically they believe that black people have something inferior about their biology, but that it can change if they're assimilated. So I'll talk about later, this originated from the climate theory, which is the theory made by Aristotle that people from hot or cold climates, so people that are on the equator or on the poles, are inherently worse than people in milder climates, because Aristotle wanted to justify Greek people being the rulers of the world, which is not, I guess, inherently racist. But then he used the justification for Greece being the ruler of the world would be that they're a race that is better than all other races, which means that the policy came first, and then the racist idea came after that to justify that policy. But yeah, moving on. So yeah, it uses for an example of segregationists, their ideals, it talks about Michael Brown, who was murdered by, what was his name? Darren Wilson, a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. And it says that segregationists have been blaming the recklessly criminal behavior of the black people who were killed by police officers. Michael Brown was a monstrous, threatening thief, therefore Darren Wilson had reason to fear him and to kill him. Anti-racists have been blaming the recklessly racist behavior of the police. The life of this dark-skinned 18-year-old did not matter to Darren Wilson. Assimilationists have tried to have it both ways. Both Wilson and Brown this government was not founded by black people. It's the N word, I'm not allowed to say that. Nor for black people, but by white men, for white men. He says that the inequality of the white and black races was stamped from the beginning, in his own words. So, that's an example of a segregationist, obviously. That's, early U.S. legal system talking about how the legal system was created by and for white people and is meant to disadvantage and disenfranchise black people. The next part, it's talking more in depth about climate theory. It says that no, this is talking about assimilationist belief. So, it says that in embracing biological racial equality, assimilationists point to environment, hot climates, discrimination, culture, and poverty as the creators of inferior black behaviors. For solutions, they maintain that the ugly black stamp can be erased, that inferior black behaviors can be developed given the proper environment. As such, assimilationists constantly encourage black adoption of white cultural traits and or physical ideals. So yeah, kind of fucked up, because these are supposed to be the people that are fighting for the rights of black people, but they're saying that we need to fix their behaviors and that, they need to turn white to be able to be, like, fucking normal. So yeah, it's a different way to see, like, segregationists and assimilationists as two groups of racists, or proponents of racist ideologies, is a different way to think about it, because in modern, like, American society, it's supposed to be Republicans are racist and Democrats are anti-racist, but thinking about it in this way opens the door to, radical politics, and, it illuminates the fact that Democrats are just as complicit, if not just, or the Democrats are just as complicit as Republicans, or, more overt racist people, in their racist ideas, and how that harms black people. Sorry. Okay, moving on. Yeah, it says okay, so this is talking about, like, criminalization of black people. You'll remember Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri was shot because he was, like, committing a crime or something. George Floyd was murdered because of a counterfeit $20 bill. So they criminalize the smallest black behaviors, but then in this part it says the shrewdest and most powerful anti-black criminals have legalized their criminal activities, have managed to define their crimes of slave trading and enslaving and discriminating and killing outside of the criminal code. Likewise, the shrewdest and most powerful racist ideologues have managed to define their ideas outside of racism. So, yeah, it's talking about how they criminalize black people for actions that they deem as illegal or against the legal system, whereas it's okay for them to do these actually illegal things, like enslaving people, things that are, like, against, like, human rights conventions and shit. So I think that's also a really good way to think about it. Moving on, we're going back to the point about racial progress and racist progress being in tandem. So those, they advance hand in hand. As some, racial progress happens after the civil rights movement was passed, then the voter ID laws happened, the mass incarceration started happening more. Legal ways to have slavery and discrimination of black people will always follow the outlying of more overt ways to do that. So this part says, the outlawing of chattel slavery in 1865 brought on racial progress. Then, the legalization of Jim Crow brought on the progression of racist policies in the late 19th century. The outlawing of Jim Crow in 1964 brought on racial progress. Then, the legalization of superficially unintentional discrimination brought on the progression of racist policies in the late 20th century. So, yeah, it's just talking about, like, yeah, I think I explained that multiple times, so you're good, probably, hopefully, thank you. produced intellectually, physically, and morally inferior people who were ugly and lacked the capacity for freedom and self-government. Aristotle labeled Africans burnt faces, which is the original meaning of Ethiopian, and viewed the ugly extremes of pale or dark skins as the effect of the extreme hot or cold climates. All of this was in the interest of normalizing Greek slaveholding practices and Greece's rule over the western Mediterranean. Aristotle situated the Greeks in their supreme intermediate climate as the most beautifully endowed superior rulers and enslavers of the world. So yeah, I think that outlines that, Aristotle was trying to justify Greece being and ruling the world and enslaving every other race. So he said that all other races were inferior and that they were meant to be enslaved by Greeks. And Christianity normalized that even more because Saint Paul introduced in the 1st century a 3-tiered hierarchy of slave relations: heavenly master at the top, which is God; earthly master in the middle, which is a slave master; and enslaved at the bottom, which is obviously enslaved people. So I think that's trying to justify, I think that's trying to situate Christianity within slavery, and it's saying how can you commit these atrocious acts while is claiming that you're one of the good ones and that you're going to go to heaven, whereas other people aren't because they aren't Christian. And I think St. Paul was trying to reckon with that. So he said, everyone's master is God, and then some people have to act as God for those smaller people, but it still really doesn't make sense logically how you could be a Christian and support slavery or racism in any way, because the point of Christianity is that everyone should be redeemable. No, so I don't see how you could, treat a human in that way and still think that you're better than them because of the color of their skin. So Christianity and racism really don't make sense together, even though they've tried so hard to make it go together, but it really just doesn't work. So then this next part is talking about one of the first public accounts of racism. So this is by a black person, by an African, Tunisian Ibn Khaldun. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but basically Ibn Khaldun was he was okay, never mind, I'm just gonna read it actually. Tunisian Ibn Khaldun, who arrived in the Fez, Morocco, just as Batuta returned from Mali. People in the dynasty whispered to each other that he must be a liar. Khaldun reported in 1377 in the Muqaddimah, the foremost Islamic history of the pre-modern world. So basically he's shitting on this other person that produces works of literature. Khaldun then painted a very different picture of sub-Sahara Africa in the Muqaddimah. The black nations are, as a rule, submissive to slavery, he says. Khaldun surmised, because black people have little that is essentially human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, and the same applies to the Slavs, argued this disciple of Aristotle. So even though he's African, he put out this work of literature that frames black people in Africa generally as submissive to slavery and worse than white people, which is really weird, and I think it was a form of colorism instead of just racism, because I guess he thought he was better than the black people that were darker skinned than him. But now it talks about so it goes back to climate theory, and it says that, darker skinned people had the capacity for physical assimilation in a colder climate, so if you placed a person that was born in Africa in Europe, that they could turn it into a white person, I guess, was their logic there. But there's another theory for why black people were, why black people should be enslaved by white people, which is the curse theory. It says, a theory somehow derived from Genesis 9:18 to 29, which said that black people were the children of Ham, the son of Noah, and that they were singled out to be black as the result of Noah's curse, which produced Ham's color and the slavery God inflicted upon his descendants, as Khaldun explained. The lineage of this curse of Ham theory also known as the curse theory, curves back through the great Persian scholar Tabari all the way to Islamic and Hebrew sources. God had permanently cursed ugly blackness and slavery into the very nature of African people, curse theorists maintained. As strictly a climate theorist, Khaldun discarded the silly story of the curse of Ham. So this guy just basically thought that it was because of the climate and not at all because of, biblical reasons that black people were submissive to slavery, but he still believed that black people were submissive to slavery and worse than white people in some way. Okay, so moving on, this is chapter 2, Origins of Racist Ideas. This is talking about, what's his name? Gomes and Eanes de Zurara, which is a Portuguese military kind of presence. He wrote a book in 1453 named The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea. Kendi says that it begins the recorded history of anti-black racist ideas. Zurara's inaugural racist ideas, in other words, were a product of, not a producer of, Prince Henry's racist policies concerning African slave trading. So this is another great example of, how policies of slave trading came first, and then the justifications for that slave trading is where the racist ideas came from. Okay, and then it says that by the mid-1400s, Slavic communities had built forts against slave raiders, causing the supply of Slavs in Western Europe's slave market to plunge at around the same time that the supply of Africans was increasing. As a result, Western Europeans began to see the natural slave not as white but black. So, I think that's also really important to think about when, if you're having a discussion with someone and they're like, well, the original slaves were white people. Does that mean that, society is rigged against white people because Slavic people were enslaved first? It's important to think about, Slavic people were also slaves, but the ideas for racism did not happen to them. Racism was not the reason that they were enslaved, and racism was not used to justify why they were enslaved thereafter. So, with Africans and black people generally, after they were enslaved and after the people enslaving them realized that they could make so much profit off of them, they justified owning those slaves with, racist ideas like curse theory or the climate theory. So that's how it disproportionately affects black people rather than how Slavs were, enslaved, but it affected black people in a different way, and now the world is structured in a different way against black people because they are supposed to be inherently worse than white people. Okay, and then the Prince of Portugal, who was the, premier slave trader of the 1400s, he tried to convince the world that he did not engage in the slave trade for money. However, a Czech traveler noticed that the King of Portugal was making more selling captives to foreigners than all the taxes levied on the entire kingdom. So, he tries to cover up his enslavement with, divine purpose, or he's freeing these people because they're not Christians or whatever. But in reality, he's doing it because it's making so much money that he, has to keep doing it, to be gaining that money. Okay. Then, it's talking about in 1481, when the Portuguese started, when Spanish colonists started going to the Americas. So this says, almost from Columbus's arrival, Spanish colonists began to degrade and enslave the indigenous American peoples, naming them blacks from the land, transferring their racist constructions of African people onto Native Americans. Over the years that followed, they used the force of the gun and the Bible in one of the most frightful and sudden massacres in human history. So, obviously, it's talking about how the indigenous genocide and black slavery were working hand in hand, but it's also important to remember that black slavery was what happened first, before the indigenous people were degraded as black people. So, if you're talking about, me personally, I'm a debater, so, if you're talking about, Afro-pessimism versus settler colonialism as a theory, you would have to go with Afro-pessimism as the root cause for settler colonialism, because the ideas of inferiority due to race happened to black people before indigenous peoples were ever even, asks, Zuazo wrote, which is a lawyer that was demanding this. In time, some indigenous peoples had caught wind of this new racist idea, and they readily agreed that a policy of importing African laborers would be better. An indigenous group in Mexico complained that the difficult and arduous work involved in harnessing a sugar crop was only for the blacks and not for the thin and weak native peoples. So yeah, I mean, it's talking, like, I think it's important to think about how some people may have been complicit in that anti-black racism because it benefited them, even though indigenous peoples were being enslaved, they were being, a genocide was being committed against them. They saw a way out, they saw a way for their people to stop being subjugated in that same way, so they threw another group under the bus. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting to think about. Okay, and then around 1510, Al-Hassan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan al-Fasi, a well-educated Moroccan, accompanied his uncle on a diplomatic mission down into the Songhai Empire, which is in Africa. 8 years later, he was enslaved on another diplomatic voyage along the Mediterranean Sea. His captors presented the learned 24-year-old to the scholarly Pope Leo X in Italy. Before dying in 1521, the Pope freed the youngster, converted him to Christianity, renamed him Johannes Leo, and possibly commissioned him to write a survey of Africa. He became known as Leo the African. He satisfied Italian curiosity in 1526 with the first scholarly survey of Africa in Europe, named Description of Africa. Yeah. Leo the African described the etymology of Africa and then surveyed African geography, languages, cultures, religions, and diseases. His summation: there is no nation under heaven more prone to venery, which is sexual indulgence. The Africans lead a beastly kind of life, being utterly destitute of the use of reason, of dexterities, of wit, and of all arts. They behave themselves as if they had continually lived in a forest among wild beasts. So, even though he is an African person, he's publishing this book that is saying that African peoples are inherently worse. Leo the African established himself through Description of Africa as the world's first known African racist, the first illustrious African producer of racist ideas. Azurara, which is the Portuguese slaveholder from earlier, if you remember, was the first illustrious European producer of racist ideas. Anyone can consume or produce racist ideas of African inferiority. Leo's African ancestry hardly shielded him from believing in African inferiority and European superiority, or from trying to convince others of this plain racist truth. I think that was a good insight that he was making there. How, it doesn't matter your race, you can still make harmful ideas, perpetuate harmful ideas. Okay. Then this is chapter 3, Coming to America, talking about the colonial history of America starting now. So it's saying that climate theory fell apart when he saw on an Arctic voyage in 1577 that the Inuit people in northeastern Canada were darker than the people living in the hotter south. In an account of the expedition, they shied away from climate theory in explaining the Ethiopians' blackness. He found an alternative, Holy Scripture, or the curse theory, that had recently been articulated by a Dominican friar in Peru and a handful of French intellectuals, a theory more enticing to slaveholders. So, climate theory was disproven by people in the far north, indigenous peoples in the far north, specifically Inuit people, had dark skin, like African people. So they shifted more to curse theory, and they leaned more into the Christian side of things than the scientific side of things. I think also it's really intriguing that, this debate of science versus, like religious, like justifications for racism, and, in general, scientific and science versus religion as a concept is like basically how our politics functions today, and how Republicans are always like, diehard Christians that are protecting the family structure and protecting traditional America, whereas liberal Democrats are sort of like trying to justify, like climate change with science. They have all these different scientific studies and think tanks that are justifying their ideas with science, but then at the same time they're both producing the same ideas about black people. So while conservative Republicans may be perpetuating fake ideas that are based on like scripture furniture, torturing them for no reason, raping their wives and children, or their women and children, they're still somehow claiming moral superiority because they treat them nice, and this white, sincere heart is inherent to them, and they should be showing them the way while they're literally murdering them. It's just crazy how colonizers and slave masters have justified their actions, even though it's completely unjustifiable for all of history. Okay, and then he's talking about playwrights in Britain. Shakespeare wrote Othello. Othello and Titus Andronicus both framed black people in his plays as, terrible people, super hypersexual, barbarians. So I didn't really know that about Shakespeare. I didn't even know he had black characters in his plays, but now I know, so that's why it's great. This book is great. So then it talks about The Mask of Blackness, which was a play, commissioned by the King of England, right? Yeah, King James the First. The Mask of Blackness was about 12 ugly African princesses of the river god Niger, who learn that they can be made beautiful if they travel to Britannia, where the sunbeams shine day and night. So this is talking about climate theory and assimilationism. These, I can't do air quotes, but no, I'm doing air quotes. These ugly African women were told that they can become beautiful if they travel to Britain. And I also thought it was really funny how they said that Britain is the place where the sun shines day and night when they don't even have the sun half of summer. she was able to find a loophole, so they trashed English law, which had been established for like centuries. They were supposed to be like the guardians of tradition and shit, but then they got rid of that law so that they could stop people like that from happening again. Which means that the way that they did that is that they said that the mother determines the baby's like freedom status. So that means that with this law in place, white enslavers could now reap financial reward from relations upon a black woman, but they wanted to prevent the limited number of white women from engaging in similar interracial relations, as their biracial babies would become free. In this way, heterosexual white men freed themselves through racist laws to engage in sexual relations with all women, and then their racist literature codified their sexual privileges. The Isle of Pines, by former English parliamentarian Henry Neville, gave readers one such ominous account. I'm not going to read all that, but basically the Isle of Pines was written by this white British man about like a secluded island that he got lost on, and he was there with 4 other women, and one of the women was black, so she specifically was hypersexualized in the story, and he says that she like came out to him in the middle of the night. So yeah, that paints the picture of an aggressive hypersexual African woman. And then that leads in the future to rapes of black women and men were not considered newsworthy. They were not, important to those people. It says newspaper reports of rape constructed white defendants as individual offenders and black defendants as representative of the failings of their racial group, which means that they're individualizing white negativity and generalizing black negativity, which I thought that this idea was also really, really intriguing. How a lot of the time when a white man or a white person does something wrong, white people will say, oh, that was just that one person, how could they do that? But when a black person does something wrong, then it's a failing of the entire race. Like, it's hard to think of an example, but, I mean, if there's a white school shooter, then, white people won't see a problem with that. It's just like, that's the norm of society. But if there's a black school shooter, or if there's a trans school shooter, or if there's, a left-leaning school shooter, then it's not a failing of that one person, it's a failing of that entire ideology, or that entire race, or that entire, gender, or, that identity. So it generalizes those activities while, individualizing the white activities, and I think that's also really important to think about. Then it starts talking about science and how scientific theory was, used to justify racism. The physics of light showed that whiteness was the chiefest color, according to, Robert Boyle, who is the father of English chemistry. So, I mean, this is an example of how Western science was created to justify racism. So, I mean, the color wheel is made with white in the middle as the combination of all colors because they believe that whiteness is isn't really just like creating conditions for black people to be seen as less than. I mean, I don't personally think that we should discount all of Western science because I think like obviously 1 plus 1 is 2. So I mean, building off of that is probably not wrong for the most part. But when we get into things that are like indisputable facts, we have to be able to question them. And I think that's like the duty of anti-racists in society today, is to create the intellectual foundations for like not a post-racial society, because that's like frowned upon as a concept, but to be able to stop racism, to be able to question racist ideas and acts, you have to think about like, you have to question everything. Like, up until literally like a few months ago, I had thought everything I had learned in school was an indisputable fact, but all of it is framed by how the teacher teaches it, how it's given to the schools, how it's filtered through the years of government, policies, and all of this history, all of this math, all of this science is filtered through racism. So if you want to think about, the world, you have to think about racism first, and anti-black racism specifically, but all these different forms of marginalization created our society, created all aspects of our society. Not anything is left untouched. So I think for me personally, in a debate round, it would be really useful to think about that. I think that's mainly why I'm reading this book, but it's giving me a lot more than just, history. It's helping me understand how the world works. But yeah, that's all I've read. The next chapter, I'll probably do soon, the next few chapters. But if you liked this video, let me know if you have any suggestions for how I can make it better, or any ideas that I might not have gone over, or anything, any feedback. Just let me know in the comments. I don't really know how this works, ASMR, because this is obviously my first time, and I am white, so I'm learning. So I accept any feedback. But if you did like this video, please leave a like. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I'll try to upload somewhat consistently. No promises though. I'll try to do it whenever I remember. But thank you for watching. Thank you for watching. And come back next time, I guess. Thank you.